Hey there. Tonight, let's head back to the dusty streets of the Old West. But not the saloon. Not the shootouts. Nope. We're going somewhere quieter. A little more velvet curtained. Let's spend a day inside a Wild West brothel where time moved slowly, perfume lingered in the air, and every creaking floorboard had a story to tell. If you like slow, sleepy history like this, I'd love it if you hit the like button, maybe even subscribe so you can drift off to more strange corners of the past with me. Super curious where you're all listening from, so drop a comment with your location and what time it is there. Always blows my mind how people are nodding off to this all over the world. Alright, fluff your pillow, settle in, and let's slip through those old red doors. The desert wind stirs early in the morning, long before the sun makes its climb over the jagged hills and sloping ridgelines that cradle this dusty, wide town. A quietness blankets the main street, broken only by the lazy clink of windmill blades and the distant bray of a mule tethered somewhere behind the livery. Wooden buildings line the dirt road like sleepy sentinels, their porches sagging under the weight of time and dust. Among them is a house set back just slightly, with soft red paint fading beneath years of sun and grit. Its shutters are drawn, its windows glow faintly from the inside, and its front doors, tall and carved with delicate floral etchings, stand closed, but they are never locked, not here. This is the brothel. Locals call it many names: the Scarlet Room, the Velvet House, the Painted Parlor. Most simply call it home, though only a few ever say it out loud. While the town still sleeps, there is movement behind those red doors. Slow, gentle movements like the stirring of coals in a dying hearth. The ladies of the house are finishing their nighttime routines. Powder is wiped from cheeks, corsets loosened, water poured into chipped porcelain bowls. Gowns are hung on brass hooks, and curls unpinned from aching scalps. The work is over, for now, and a new day begins. Downstairs in the parlor, the scent of tobacco still lingers from the night before. A lamp burns low on the piano, its light barely reaching the velvet chaise where a shawl has been left behind. Footsteps echo softly down the narrow staircase, bare feet on creaking boards. The madam descends first, always early, always poised. She wears a robe of dark green satin, cinched at the waist with a long velvet sash. In her right hand, she carries a brass key ring that jangles faintly, and in her left, a tin cup of coffee strong, black, and hot enough to wake the dead. Her name is Miss Hattie, and she has run this house for 17 years. Outside, the morning stagecoach has not yet arrived. The street remains empty, save for a tumbleweed idly rolling toward the post office, and the fluttering laundry strung behind the boarding house next door. It is in these early hours, before the saloons swing open their doors and the blacksmith strikes his first hammer blow, that the brothel exists in its quietest, most human form. Before the guests return, before the show begins, Miss Hattie opens a window and lets the cool morning air inside. She lights a new lamp and sets it beside a vase of dried lavender. She then moves through the parlor with practiced grace, adjusting curtains, checking that the piano's cloth cover hasn't shifted, straightening a photograph of a long-forgotten mayor who once declared this house a public disgrace before quietly visiting twice a week for the next 3 years. The house has its secrets. It always has. In the back rooms, the girls begin to rise. There's Annabelle, who was once a dressmaker in Kansas City and still insists on mending everyone's hems by hand. She hums quietly as she washes her face, always the same tune, a lullaby she half remembers from childhood. Next to her is Lottie, younger than the rest, who arrived only 3 months ago with a valise full of books and a nervous laugh that has since grown into a confident smile. Lottie doesn't speak much in the morning, but she always sits by the window to watch the sun crest the hills. She writes little notes on scraps of paper and keeps them folded in a box under her bed. Then there is Madame Jeanette, who has been here longer than even Miss Hattie, though no one knows exactly how old she island. She speaks French when she's tired and sings to herself while steeping tea with a blend of herbs she swears keeps the lungs clear. She wears velvet robes and pins her silver hair into elaborate twists. When she walks, the floorboards somehow never creak. Their day begins slowly. Breakfast is a quiet affair: coffee, leftover biscuits, maybe a bit of jam if they're lucky. No one eats much. It's more ritual than sustenance. The conversation is soft, full of murmured reflections on the night before and musings about who might visit later. A traveling magician is rumored to be passing through. One of the girls rolls her eyes. Another giggles. Someone's pocket watch ticks softly on the mantel. In this house, time moves differently. The chores are shared without needing to be assigned. One girl dusts the parlor, another polishes the mirrors. Someone empties the ashtrays and wipes down the wooden banisters with a cloth dampened from the well. There is a rhythm to it all, a domestic calmness that settles deep in the bones. The brothel, for all its nighttime fanfare, is a home first and foremost. Outside, the town begins to wake. The blacksmith's hammer rings out once. A dog barks. A shopkeeper drags open his front gate. Hoofbeats echo faintly from the far end of town as a rancher rides through with feed for the horses. But inside, the house remains soft, insulated by layers of velvet, perfume, and memory. Miss Hattie opens the ledger and begins to write. Not just the numbers, though, there are always numbers, but names, notes, details about guests, moods, behaviors, promises made and broken. She records it all in looping script, with a quiet understanding that the ledger is more than a business record. It is a chronicle, a silent confession, a memory of everything the walls have witnessed and will never repeat aloud. Later, perhaps, there will be music, a rehearsal on the piano, a new dress to be fitted. Perhaps someone will read a poem out loud or tell a story from back east. But for now, the day is young. The brothel, once filled with laughter and footsteps and the clinking of glasses, rests in its quieter self, its gentler self. A place of women, of whispers, of deep exhalations after long nights. The red doors remain closed, but behind them, life continues at its own slow pace. And as the sun finally warms the porch, catching the corners of lace curtains and cracked shutters, the house exhales. Just a little. It is morning in the Wild West, and the brothel begins another day. By the time the town's bakery bell chimes 8 times its copper tongue echoing softly across Main Street, the brothel's upstairs hallway is filled with the low rustle of skirts, the squeak of old floorboards, and the faint fragrance of lavender, rosewater, and beeswax. Light filters in through the long lace curtains that line the corridor windows, spilling golden patterns across the worn rugs below. It is a slow morning. It is always a slow morning here. The girls are up, if not fully awake, and the house has begun its familiar, practiced stretch into the day. In the second room on the left, Annabelle stands in front of her mirror, arms bent behind her back as she fastens the final hook of her corset. She does this every morning, always with a certain pride in her movements, as though each tug of the ribbon were part of a private ritual, known only to her. Her fingers are fast and precise. She has never needed help with it. The corset is deep plum, lined with cotton and trimmed with lace at the top edge. It squeaks faintly as it tightens. Next door, Lottie is still in her dressing gown, perched on a little stool near the window. She has yet to fasten her stays and instead nurses a cup of coffee black and bitter, the way Miss Hattie prefers it. She watches the street below with a quiet gaze. Two boys are chasing a chicken past the stables, and a man in a brown hat pauses to tip his hat toward the general store's clerk. Lottie takes a small sip and lets the warmth settle in her throat. Her room is a scatter of soft things, ribbon-trimmed gloves draped over the chair, a half-read novel on the nightstand, stockings rolled neatly and set beside her shoes. On the wall hangs a small framed photograph of a dog she once owned back in Arkansas. She doesn't talk about Arkansas much. None of the girls really speak of where they came from, not unless the mood is just right and the hour is very late. In the farthest room at the end of the hall, Madame Jeanette has already finished her toilette. Her silvery hair is twisted into a sculptural knot, and she wears a robe of faded peacock blue with sleeves that trail like theater curtains. Her vanity table is a display of careful order: bone-handled brushes, bottles with handwritten labels, an old music box that no longer plays. She dabs a bit of lemon balm onto her wrists and then breathes deeply. A bell chimes from the hallway below. Breakfast is ready. The parlor is quiet when the girls come down, one by one. Their steps are slow, not rushed. The house encourages slowness. Annabelle is first, her slippers making no sound on the stairwell. Lottie follows, her dressing gown belted tight at the waist. Then two more, Rosa and Hetty, each wrapped in shawls, each with sleep still clinging to their eyelashes. Miss Hattie waits in the dining room, seated at the head of the table with her brass coffee cup already half empty. She does not eat breakfast, but she always sits with the girls, observing, listening, smoothing stray curls with her perfectly manicured fingers. The table is simple: tin plates, white linen napkins, a bowl of boiled eggs, a plate of biscuits, some slightly overdone. There's apple preserves in a small china dish and a slab of butter beginning to melt in the warmth. Someone giggles, someone yawns, someone murmurs that the preserves are better than yesterday's. No one disagrees. Conversation remains soft and slow, like the clink of spoons against ceramic. Lottie mentions that the man from the dry goods store winked at her yesterday. Rosa rolls her eyes and mutters something about men in general. Hetty asks if there's still time to rehem her skirt before the evening. Annabelle offers to help. Jeanette requests more hot water for her tea. And through it all, Miss Hattie watches. Calm, composed. She notes each exchange in her mind, like a ledger of moods. She knows that Annabelle's stitching means she's nervous, that Lottie's gaze out the window suggests homesickness, that Rosa's sarcasm is more defense than jest. She knows the girls better than they know themselves. That is her talent. That, and keeping the house steady, even when the world outside tilts. After breakfast, the girls drift to their tasks. The day is not one of leisure, not entirely. Rooms must be tidied, sheets changed, parlors dusted, stockings washed and hung. Each girl tends to her space with a quiet dignity, their movements part of the rhythm of the house. In the laundry room, a small back corner lit by a single oil lamp, Hetty stands over a wash tub with sleeves rolled up and apron tied tight. She hums as she scrubs, the sleeves of a chemise swishing in the suds. The scent of lye soap mixes with the steam and the gentle creak of the wringer. Outside the window, a cat stalks lazily across the alley fence, blinking in the rising heat. Back in the main parlor, Annabelle polishes the piano keys with a chamois cloth. Each key is wiped gently, as if the piano were a sleeping child. The mirror above the piano is smudged with fingerprints from the night before. She rubs them away with a spritz of rose water and a square of linen. The mirror returns her face, softly blurred, slightly tired, quietly strong. Lottie rearranges the parlor's reading shelf small collections of poetry, old almanacs, a battered copy of Jane Eyre that always seems to disappear for days and return again with its pages slightly more worn. She lingers over a book of pressed wildflowers, turning the pages carefully, her fingers trailing the faded stems. She doesn't notice Miss Hattie watching her from the stairwell. Time passes slowly in the morning. The brothel breathes like a creature at rest. Outside, the town grows louder. Horses clatter down the street. The blacksmith hammers again and again. A preacher yells something about sin from his corner near the hotel. The sheriff nods to a woman on her way to the bakery. But in here, the house remains quiet, wrapped in lace and shadow. Eventually, the chores are done. The sun is high. The girls return to their rooms to rest, or write, or bathe. Miss Hattie retreats to her office, a small room behind the parlor, where ledgers are kept locked and letters are written with slow care. She lights a stick of incense and closes the curtains. She'll draft an order for new linens today. She's been meaning to for weeks. Upstairs, Lottie reclines with a paperback, and Annabelle sketches the embroidery she'll try later. Jeanette naps. Rosa plays with a ribbon in her fingers, twisting it in and out of shapes while humming something old and slightly sad. And the brothel, its red doors warm beneath the noonday sun, slips deeper into its quiet routine. It is a house unlike any other in the West, filled with women, with whispers, with the soft press of hands against velvet and the weight of silence between songs. The day stretches out, soft and unhurried. The girls will rest, and soon they will prepare again. Powder, rouge, perfume, satin, the hum of the piano tuning up. But for now, in the hush of midday, corsets are loosened, coffee is cooling in its cups, and the house exhales into calm. It is, like most things here, just another slow beginning. As the last of the guests settled into their places at the long wooden tables, their curiosity quieted by steaming bowls of broth and baskets of crusty bread, a subtle shift in the atmosphere signaled the approach of the evening spectacle. A hush fell over the great hall, the hum of conversation ebbing into expectant silence, as if the very stone walls had leaned in to listen. The great iron chandelier above flickered gently, the waxy scent of candles mingling with roasted meats and distant hay. Then, from beyond the heavy drapes at the far end of the arena, a low, brassy note unfurled into the air, the unmistakable blast of a herald's trumpet. Children sat up straighter, adults leaned forward, and fingers froze mid-bite. The herald's call, crisp, ancient, and full of pomp, was not merely an introduction, but a ritual. It marked the boundary between the mundane world of dinner plates and the heightened pageantry of a royal tournament. With a dramatic sweep of the drapes, the herald appeared. Clad in a tunic of deep crimson and gold, the emblem of the lion and stag stitched in glimmering thread across his chest, he moved with deliberate purpose, holding a scroll high above his head. His hat was feathered, his boots polished, and his posture impossibly straight. His voice, when he spoke, filled every crevice of the room. Good gentles all, lords and ladies of noble heart and curious tongue, welcome. This eve, beneath the stars of our beloved realm, ye shall witness feats of valor and strength, honor and cunning, as brave knights vie for glory in the name of king and country. The room erupted into applause, a gentle ripple at first, growing in confidence as mugs clinked and boots stomped in appreciation. The herald let the energy rise for a moment before lifting a gloved hand to call for stillness once more. His Majesty, King Edward the Lion-Hearted, sends his greetings and blessings. And now by the powers vested in me, and by the ancient laws of tournament and honor, I declare the games. Begun. A drumbeat sounded from the wings, slow and steady, like the heartbeat of the kingdom itself. The arena gates creaked open. From the dusky corridor emerged a rider astride a great war horse, the steed's hooves muffled by the sandy arena floor. The knight wore chainmail that shimmered in the candlelight, and a helm adorned with a blue plume. His tabard bore the sigil of the falcon, a sharp-eyed predator on a field of silver. He rode to the center of the arena, saluted the king's box, which tonight housed a painted wooden throne beneath rich velvet drapes, and wheeled his horse in a tight arc, making the armor clink and jingle with noble music. Behind him, another knight entered, then another, until 6 had arrived, each representing a different region of the kingdom, their colors bold and banners snapping in the rising heat of anticipation. The herald introduced each by name, lineage, and deed: Sir Aldrich of Glenmore, famed for his lance work; Sir Rowan of Halford, whose sword had never been bested; Lady Elsinore of Northreach, the sole woman among them, but with the skill of any 10 men. Her presence drew a particular swell of cheers. Children pointed in awe. Elders nodded in approval. The performers below had become, for a few hours, real knights once more. There was a certain charm in it, a suspension of disbelief wrapped in velvet and steel. The herald raised his arms once again. "Let the banners fly, let the steeds be loosed, and let the trumpet sound." Another fanfare burst forth, and the knights lined up on either side of the arena. Pages darted about like sprites, delivering lances and adjusting saddle straps. Flags were waved from balconies. Servers wove between tables, refilling goblets and offering roasted fowl with thick gravy. And as the first joust began, 2 knights thundering toward one another with wooden lances at the ready, the audience leaned in, eyes wide, mouths agape, some cheering, some gasping, some simply watching in drowsy awe as the medieval dream unfurled before them. The sound of splintering wood echoed through the hall. The games had truly begun. The parlor had grown quieter still by mid-afternoon. The sunlight, once golden and direct, now stretched in longer, lazier beams through the brothel's tall lace curtains, casting shadows that moved only when the breeze lifted the fabric ever so slightly. The day had settled into that in-between hush, the town outside pausing between its early bustle and evening stirrings. And inside, the air seemed thicker, warmer, and even more still. Down the narrow back hallway, past the linen closet and the pantry door that never fully closed, sat a small, creaking room lined with bookcases and a squat roll-top desk. The girls called it the tally room, though no one ever really said why. It wasn't for counting heads or tallying sins, it was where the madam kept the house ledger, and where inked records painted the real story of the brothel, quiet and unglamorous, in neat copperplate handwriting. The ledger was a large, worn book, its corners softened by years of turning, its leather cracked along the spine. Each page held columns for names, dates, services rendered, payments collected, debts owed, and bonuses given. It was the brothel's heartbeat, in black and blue ink proof, that this house, as fanciful and free-spirited as it might seem, ran on numbers as much as charm. Miss Geneva kept it up to date. Not the madam, but Geneva, the oldest of the girls, if she could still be called a girl, and the one everyone trusted to be fair. Her hair had silver streaks she didn't bother to hide anymore, and her corsets were looser these days, worn more for habit than necessity. Geneva had been in the brothel long before any of the others, and some whispered she'd even come from a bigger city, Chicago, maybe, or Street Louis. But no one asked directly, and she never offered much. She simply smiled and kept the books tidy. This afternoon, Geneva sat hunched over the desk, the sunlight catching in her spectacles as she dipped her pen in the inkwell and flipped open the ledger with gentle hands. Her fingers, though stiff with age, moved carefully down the page. She paused now and then to tally figures in her head, whispering softly to herself, 2 for Clementine yesterday, 1 today. Whiskey surcharge, minus the broken basin from last week. Her voice was soft, almost like a lullaby to the numbers themselves. Behind her, a small stovetop kettle hissed. Geneva had a habit of steeping tea while she worked, not for ceremony, but for comfort. The scent of mint and dried chamomile wafted gently through the tally room, curling around the corners of old furniture and rising into the hallway beyond. Every so often, a girl would knock softly and poke her head in. "Do I still owe for the gloves?" Ada asked, leaning in. Geneva nodded slowly. 3 cents left on them. Pay it when you can. "Thank you, love," Ada said, and disappeared again, her perfume trailing behind. Then it was Dolly, barefoot as always, with ink smudged on her cheek from some forgotten doodle. "You marked down Mr. Pierce's visit last night?" she asked, biting her lip like a schoolgirl. Geneva smiled without turning. "Page 128. You had the strawberry wine. I marked it." Dolly sighed in relief and flitted away. It was all very routine, but within the walls of the brothel, this simple work meant everything. The girls knew the ledger kept things fair, made sure no one was shorted, and ensured the house ran smooth as a lullaby. The madam, for all her silks and sharp eyes, left this part entirely to Geneva. The room itself held little decor, just the desk, the shelves, and the old velvet curtain that could be pulled over the doorway for privacy. But there was one item of personal charm, a small wind-up music box that sat on the window ledge. It was painted with tiny roses, the kind you'd find in a child's nursery or a parlor back east. Geneva wound it sometimes, when she was alone or when the day had grown too heavy. The melody it played was soft and melancholy, a waltz that drifted into the floorboards and ceilings like smoke. A lullaby not for children, but for the tired women of this house. Today, she wound it absent-mindedly as she tallied up the expenses for fresh linens, and added a line item for the broken lantern in room 5. The music began with a faint click and a slow spin, its soft notes spilling into the silence. And as it played, Geneva paused her writing and looked out the small window. From here, the world outside looked oddly still. A wagon passed slowly down the dusty main road, its driver humming something inaudible. A dog slept under the porch of the general store. A tumbleweed bounced lazily along a fence line. Inside, the music box slowed its turning, and the room fell silent again. It was in these quiet stretches that the brothel felt almost sacred, like a monastery of worn carpets and whispered truths, where the ledger was scripture and Geneva its scribe. A knock on the outer hallway door brought the moment to a gentle end. The kettle let out one last hiss, and Geneva closed the ledger carefully, sliding the ink bottle into its usual nook and blowing gently on the drying page. She moved slowly, knees creaking, as she stood and made her way toward the sound. She knew the knock well. It belonged to the merchant from the dry goods store. He didn't come for the girls, not really. He came to settle bills, deliver letters, and sometimes just to sit and listen to Geneva's music box play. The sun was dipping lower now. Long rays streaked across the floor, painting the wood with slanted gold. The tally room dimmed in stages, like a lamp being turned down for evening. And so the day moved on, gently, slowly, and always with that sense of quiet rhythm. The house breathed in time with the ledger's pages, and exhaled in soft whispers, footsteps, and fading notes from a painted music box. And the lullaby of ink, tea, and distant piano continued. By late afternoon, the sun no longer blazed but lingered, low and mellow in the western sky. Its golden rays crept along the floorboards of the upstairs dressing room, brushing against worn rugs, half-buttoned boots, and the many mirrors that lined the walls like quiet sentinels. The upstairs had grown warm, not uncomfortably so, but with that still heat that made every movement slower, every breath deeper, every thought a touch heavier. This was the time the girls began to ready themselves for the evening before the clatter of boots on the saloon floor, before the poker games grew rowdy, before the piano's lively tune rattled window panes and whiskey sloshed into glasses. This quiet hour, filled with soft laughter, rustling fabric, and the occasional clink of a hairpin on the floor, was known simply as prettifying time. The dressing room wasn't grand, not like some imagined. It was functional, worn, but lived, in a patchwork of satin ribbons, scent bottles, half-laced corsets, and the powdery smell of rouge. The walls were hung with hooks that bore colorful garments like flags of a gentle rebellion, velvet skirts, ruffled chemises, silken sashes, and beaded shawls that shimmered faintly in the amber light. Clara, always the first to begin, stood by the tall mirror with her corset half tightened. She grunted softly as she pulled the laces, the fabric of her chemise rustling with each tug. "It's the bread," she muttered to herself, though no one had asked. "That new baker in town, he uses too much honey." In the corner, Dolly sat cross-legged on a stool, brushing out her honey-colored hair with long, slow strokes. The bristles whispered through her locks, a steady rhythm like rain on canvas. She had no corset yet, just a slip, and her stocking feet resting on the stool's bottom rung. "Should I do blue or the red one tonight?" she asked no one in particular. From behind the hanging sheet that served as a curtain for changing, a voice replied, muffled and amused. "Red's for flirting, blue's for tips." Dolly smiled. "Tips it is." Genevieve, the statuesque brunette with a birthmark shaped like a leaf on her shoulder, emerged from the curtain, adjusting her bodice and tying the last ribbon of her crinoline. She looked around the room with quiet satisfaction, like a mother hen counting her chicks. "Let's not forget it's Mr. McIntyre's birthday tonight. He'll be bringing half the bank clerks." Groans rippled through the room, light-hearted but genuine. "He smells like pennies and gin," Ada said, powdering her face with small, careful taps. "And he talks too close," added June, who was balancing on one leg to fasten a lace garter. Still, they all prepared, not because they loved Mr. McIntyre or birthdays or even the sound of the saloon's laughter, but because it was what the day demanded. The brothel had its own rhythm, and the dressing room was its metronome: tick, tock, brush, tie, lace, perfume. There was an artistry to it. Corsets were not just garments, they were scaffolds of transformation. A woman stepped into one kind of skin and emerged into another. It was not about changing who she was, but rather sharpening her outline, her silhouette, her sway, her sense of command. A laced corset pulled her into focus, into form, into presence. And so the lacing continued. In the corner stood a worn chaise lounge where old bonnets were piled like fallen crowns. A cat, unbothered by the flurry of motion, slept there. Often its name was either Whiskey or Clementine, depending on who you asked. Tonight it slept through the powder and perfume, a patch of orange fur rising and falling with each breath. Ada hummed as she buttoned her boots, low-heeled, soft leather, scuffed from dancing and pacing. Her fingers moved with practiced ease, though she paused now and then to sip from the chipped teacup balanced on a nearby crate. The tea was lukewarm now, but she didn't seem to mind. "What color's the parlor curtains now?" asked Clara, still adjusting the busk of her corset. "Dark green with gold fringe," Genevieve answered without looking up. "Madam swapped them out this morning. Green makes my teeth look yellow." "Then don't smile." They all laughed not harshly, but softly, like wind through prairie grass. It was the laughter of those who'd learned how to lean into the strange theater of the evening ahead. Because every dress they wore was a kind of costume, and every smile was a curtain lifted on the night's long performance. Rouge was passed around, along with tiny tins of beeswax for brows, kohl pencils for eyelids, and tiny glass bottles of violet water dabbed onto wrists. There were combs with carved handles, scarves that carried the scent of old perfume, and brooches with missing stones. Every item had a story. Every hemline remembered a night. "Zip me," Dolly murmured, turning her back to June. A gentle tug, a whispered curse, a giggle, a satisfied nod. Downstairs, the piano plunked out a test note, then another, then a run of chords that signaled the arrival of the pianist early, as always. His name was Ezra, and he played with long fingers and tired eyes. The sound drifted up the stairs like perfume, and all the girls paused just briefly. Showtime was near. In the final moments before they descended, the room stilled for just a heartbeat. The mirror reflected a dozen versions of readiness, some in full color, some still fastening clasps, others simply gazing into the glass, adjusting a curl, checking their posture. And for that small moment, each one was simply a woman preparing to face the night. It didn't matter whether she was 30 or 20, whether her gown was new or patched, whether her earrings matched or dangled unevenly. She was preparing the best version of herself she could offer that evening, in that town, under that fading Wild West Sunday. And when they descended, one by one, the parlor would bloom into color and movement and sound. Laughter would rise, music would swell, drinks would pour, and somewhere in the background, the dressing room would sit in silence once more, awaiting tomorrow's dance. The parlor came alive with the slow glow of gas lamps, flickering gently in their glass sleeves like shy fireflies. Shadows danced along the walls, climbing and shrinking with every movement of the girls or tilt of a guest's hat. Downstairs, the saloon's chatter had ripened into a soft roar, and the brothel's drawing room just above the din began to fill, as it did most nights, with the slow parade of boots, bourbon, and boastful stories. The parlor wasn't grand, not like some you'd find in the bigger cities, but it was tasteful, even elegant by frontier standards. A Persian rug, its reds faded to rose and rust, lay across the creaking floorboards. Velvet chairs sagged with age but held their dignity, and doilies rested neatly on every armrest. The piano in the corner, its ivory keys worn thin, hummed softly under Ezra's long fingers, playing a waltz that no one danced to but everyone seemed to sway with. Men trickled in with the dusk, hats in hand, manners at the door. They came with the smell of sweat and saddle leather, of pipe smoke and prairie dust. Some were dressed in crisp linen, others in work-worn flannel. Some had stories to tell, others had wounds they wouldn't speak of. A young cattleman named Reed leaned on the bar with one boot hooked behind the other. His mustache was too thin to be taken seriously, but he spoke like he'd seen it all. "So there I was," he said, sipping from a shot of rot-gut whiskey. 6 of them Comanches surrounding my wagon bareback, war paint, shouting to the heavens. I didn't blink. I just stared 'em down and said, "Boys, this ain't your day." Ada, reclining on a worn settee, raised an eyebrow. "You told them that?" she said, her voice syrupy smooth. "I did," Reed grinned. "And they just let you go?" she asked, twirling a strand of hair. "Well," he hesitated, "one of 'em had a bad cough, so I offered him a swig of rye. Thought it polite." The room chuckled. The tale was tall, its truth thinner than dust. But no one came to the brothel to audit stories. They came for warmth, for attention, for the comforting theater of being listened to. Near the fire, a small table of bank clerks dealt slow hands of poker, the cards worn soft as flannel and smelling faintly of tobacco. Their laughter was tinny and polite, punctuated by the occasional clatter of coins or the pop of a cork. One of them, a man with reddish sideburns and ink stains on his cuffs, stared too long at Genevieve whenever she passed, though he never mustered the courage to speak. At the hearth, Dolly sat with her feet tucked beneath her, sipping a weak gin and tonic and listening to a grizzled prospector spin yarns about the Colorado hills. He had one good boot, a limp, and a heart full of quartz dust. "Gold's like a woman," he said, his voice crackling like dry leaves. "It don't show itself all at once. You gotta work for it, court it proper, and even then, it might leave you with just a speck and a broken pan." Dolly smiled gently. "You ever strike it rich?" He looked at the bottom of his empty glass. "Once, but I drank it." Ezra's piano playing drifted like fog through the room, slow, patient, steady. He didn't look at the girls much, or the men either. His eyes followed his fingers, and his mind seemed always somewhere just behind the music. He played old songs, the kind that spoke in quiet tongues, in memory and melody. The kind that could make even the loudest braggart speak softer. In the corner, a young man in a borrowed suit sat alone, nervously smoothing his lapels. He had the look of someone who had saved for months just to be here. June noticed and made her way over, taking a seat with a practiced rustle of skirts. "You new in town?" she asked. He nodded. "Arrived yesterday from Kansas. Got a job driving wagons for the railway." "Well then," June said, offering a smile, "tonight you get to rest those hands and enjoy a little company. First time's always the sweetest." His ears turned red. "Thank you, ma'am." "Don't call me ma'am," she said gently. "Call me June." Across the room, a man in a dusty bowler hat played harmonica badly, adding an off-key background to Ezra's steady piano. No one minded. It was all part of the night, the layers of sound, the scent of lamp oil and perfume, the clinking of glass, and the rustle of long skirts brushing against worn floorboards. The madam, who rarely came down this early, made a quiet round through the room, nodding politely at familiar faces. She didn't speak unless spoken to, but her eyes missed nothing. She checked the temperature of the lamps, the freshness of the lemon water, the length of the ash in the fireplace. Then, satisfied, she returned upstairs, like a shadow slipping behind a curtain. Out back, beyond the kitchen door, someone chopped wood slowly, rhythmically. The thud echoed faintly into the parlor whenever the back door swung open to fetch more water or discard a bucket of slush. The night was cool now, the summer heat fading into the dark. Clara leaned against the bar, speaking with a man who said he was part of a traveling circus. He claimed to wrestle bears for a living, though he had the hands of a poet. She listened with half her attention, the other half watching the flames curl inside the stove nearby. The room breathed, laughed, whispered. It did not rush. Men who bragged too loud eventually quieted, lulled by the softness of touch and the lullaby of the piano. Girls who had begun the night in full color now lounged in shadows, their voices gentler, their laughter lower. Time, in this place, moved not by clocks, but by mood. It flowed in loops and ripples, like the whiskey being poured slow, warm, and without sharp edges. And somewhere just beyond the lamplight, the night deepened. Outside, coyotes sang in the distance. The stars above the plains blinked down like tired eyes. Inside, under velvet and gaslight, the stories kept spinning wild, wistful, and only half true, just the way everyone liked them. Upstairs, the air changed. It was quieter, softer, as if the world below, with all its voices and clinking glasses, had been muffled by the thick velvet curtains and thick rugs on creaking floorboards. The scent of lamp oil still lingered faintly, but here it mingled with rosewater, lavender, and a hint of powder, a delicate cloud that hung in the air like memory. Each room along the narrow hallway had its own hum. The doors, painted in peeling whites and soft pastels, bore numbers once gold but now dulled by time. Some were slightly ajar, others firmly closed. All were lit by the soft flicker of gaslight sconces, and some had lace curtains pulled tightly across small windows, their edges fluttering just so in the warm breeze that slipped through cracked panes. At the top of the stairs, a wide mirror with a gilt frame reflected the slow hush of night. Anyone glancing into it might have seen a woman smoothing her dress, a man adjusting his collar, or nothing at all, just a slow parade of footsteps in secret. Clara's room was second on the left. She'd taken the time to place a single porcelain teacup on her washstand, a saucer beneath it, and a lavender sprig resting gently inside. Her mirror was polished, her combs laid out neatly, her bedspread freshly turned down. It wasn't grand, but it was hers, and it smelled faintly of orange peel and old letters. Tonight, she had a guest. He was quiet, a man of few words. They'd shared a drink in the parlor, just one, and he had tipped his hat to her as if she were royalty. That kind of guest was rare. She liked rare. She liked silence. They didn't speak much, as she closed the door behind them and locked it with a quiet click. Just the sound of boots settling on the floor and the soft rustle of skirts. A room over, Dolly was humming to herself. Her lamp cast a circle of gold onto the quilt at the foot of her bed, where she sat cross-legged, reading aloud from a penny romance to a nervous guest who hadn't made it past his vest buttons. She liked to read to them sometimes. If they listened, she knew it would be a gentle evening. The stranger leaned close. She read in a whisper, her voice sweet and slow, his breath warm on her cheek. "Miss Delilah," he murmured, "I fear I've wandered far for the very purpose of finding you." The guest chuckled, looking at the floor. Down the hall, Genevieve lit 3 candles in small ceramic holders and placed them on her windowsill. Her guest, a ranch foreman who smelled faintly of leather and cedar, sat in the corner chair, watching her. He was older, his beard tinged gray, and he kept removing his hat only to put it back on again. Nervous hands, kind eyes. She sat beside him, not touching, just close. They talked about horses, about how the stars looked different when you were out on the plains at night. She loved it when men talked about stars. They always did so with wonder in their voice, like boys again, before the world made them hard. June's room was filled with soft fabric and louder laughter. She'd drawn her curtain halfway, letting the moonlight pour in like milk. Her guest, a traveling salesman from Missouri, was trying to tell a joke he'd already forgotten the ending to. She laughed anyway, handing him a second glass of brandy and adjusting his cravat with practiced fingers. She wasn't in a rush. She never was. That was the secret to her charm, her ability to make a man feel as though time had been suspended just for him. In the very last room on the right, Ada sat at her vanity brushing her hair. Her guest had excused himself for a moment, gone to fetch something from his coat downstairs. She knew he wouldn't be back right away. Some didn't return at all. That was fine. She liked the brushing. 100 strokes, every night, whether alone or not. The sound of bristles through hair, steady, rhythmic, familiar, was one of the few things that still reminded her of childhood. The hallway remained hushed, the floorboards old and whispering beneath every step. Occasionally, one of the girls would pad barefoot from one room to another, fetching a shawl, refilling a pitcher, borrowing a hairpin. They spoke in murmurs, eyes half-lidded with fatigue and warm lamplight. Back near the stairs, the madam sat quietly in her own small room. Her bed was narrow and made with military precision. Her bookshelves were filled with slim volumes, ledgers, poetry, and well-thumbed paperbacks. She sipped from a chipped cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. Through the thin walls, she could hear the slow ebb and flow of voices, the creak of bed springs, the low rumble of distant music from the saloon far below. She did not smile. She did not frown. She simply listened, one eye on the ledger on her lap, the other half lost to memory. Nights like these were ordinary, but in their ordinariness, they had a kind of sacred rhythm. Outside, the moon was high now, casting long silver beams over the crooked roofs and horse rails below. The town was quieting. The sheriff's office had gone dark, and the clinking of spurs on boardwalks had faded into the gentle clatter of wind-blown leaves and shutter slats. Even the coyotes had quieted. Inside the brothel, the rooms glowed like lanterns in a sea of shadow. Inside those lanterns, hearts beat slower. Hands grew gentle. Words softened. Some guests paid just to sleep beside someone, to forget the hardness of the world for a night. Others needed a story, a song, or the soothing sound of another person breathing nearby. Not all desires were carnal. Many were not. And those were the nights that stayed with the girls longest, the nights when someone simply needed to be seen, heard, held. As midnight passed and slipped quietly into morning, one by one the candles burned low. One by one the doors creaked closed. One by one the rooms fell into silence. And still, upstairs, the moonlight poured through lace and glass, painting patterns on the girls' beds, their walls, their skin, soft patterns, pale ribbons of light, the kind that made you think for just a moment that the world outside didn't matter at all. The kind of moonlight that wrapped itself around sorrow and hope alike, holding both as gently as a lullaby. The sun did not rise with a shout. It crept instead soft and silver pink over the hills and rooftops, spilling down the cracked bricks and warped wooden walls of the brothel like it wasn't quite sure it belonged. The sky was pale lavender, slowly bleeding into gold, while a few early birds called low from the eaves, their wings fluttering in the still cool air. Inside the brothel, everything was quiet. The parlor downstairs stood empty, the fire long gone to ash, and the oil lamps flickering out one by one, their wicks curling like old paper. The poker chips from the night before still lay in disarray on the corner table. A half-drunk glass of bourbon sat forgotten near the edge of the piano, the amber liquid catching the sunrise just enough to glow faintly, like a memory that hadn't quite faded. The rug beneath the piano stool was askew. A woman's fan lay beneath it, ivory and red silk. It hadn't been noticed yet. It would wait until someone came looking. Upstairs, the doors were closed. Each room was a story paused in the middle. Some beds were made with the precision of someone who'd risen early and alone. Others remained tangled, the sheets bunched and half falling to the floor. A few still held the slow, steady breath of sleep within them, sighing figures curled beneath thin quilts, lost in dreams or the soft nothingness that comes after a long night. The floorboards creaked as Dolly tiptoed barefoot toward the washroom, her nightdress brushing her ankles. She carried a tin basin filled with water that sloshed gently with each careful step. Her face was soft with sleep, eyes half closed, hair falling in curls she hadn't yet pinned up. She didn't knock. She didn't need to. The house had its rhythm, and she was part of it. She passed Genevieve's room, where the door was slightly ajar. A breeze moved through the lace curtain, lifting its edge with the shy confidence of dawn. Inside, Genevieve still lay on her side, one hand beneath her cheek, her guest already gone. The scent of him lingered faintly: tobacco, leather, pine sap. His boots had scuffed the floor. He'd left coins on the washstand, neatly stacked. Ada was awake, but barely. She sat at her small table with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, cradling a cup of bitter coffee. It steamed in the chill morning air. Her window was cracked open just enough to let in the smell of dust, dry earth, and wood smoke. She watched the horizon quietly, eyes unfocused. No thoughts chased her, not yet. June had risen first, as she often did. Her bed was made, her hands already scrubbing the basin clean with a square of linen. Her curls were pinned up with practiced care, and a soft yellow ribbon tied loosely at her collar. She hummed as she worked, a slow, wordless tune she remembered from childhood. She never sang the lyrics anymore, they were too sharp. Below, the madam moved through the parlor in slippers, her housecoat pulled tight against the chill. She carried a ledger and a stub of pencil. Her hair was braided back in a no-nonsense coil. She took notes, quiet ones. A door that needed fixing, a loose tile by the bar, a mirror that had cracked near its corner and would need replacing soon. She noted it all without judgment. The morning was for noticing. Judgment came later, if ever. One by one, the girls stirred. Clara yawned into her pillow before rising, rubbing her eyes as she swung her legs over the edge of the bed. The floor was cold, the boards biting against her bare feet. She took a breath, a slow one, then another, and then she stood, wrapping her shawl around her shoulders as the light crept through her window and made halos out of the dust. In the kitchen, someone had already put on the kettle. The smell of firewood and black coffee mingled with the fading perfume and candle wax of the night before. A loaf of bread had been left uncovered, its crust hardened slightly, but still good. A tin of preserves sat beside it. Peach, perhaps. Or plum. It would do. Breakfast at the brothel wasn't a ceremony. It was survival. The girls moved in shifts, some silent, others trading sleepy greetings. A cracked plate, a chipped mug, a soft clink of spoon against ceramic. No chatter, no plans. Just quiet nourishment and the long sigh of women whose bodies ached in places they couldn't quite name. Dolly sat on the windowsill with her tea. She watched the blacksmith's boy chase a chicken across the alley, both of them slipping on the dewy boards of the walkway. She smiled faintly, but didn't laugh. That would come later, if it came at all. Genevieve joined Ada near the stove. Neither spoke, just Saturday together. Down the hall, someone vomited into a bucket. It wasn't unusual. A long night, too much drink, not enough water. June fetched a cloth without being asked. She held it to the girl's forehead and whispered something only the two of them would ever hear. The brothel woke slowly, like a great animal that had spent the night prowling in silk and candlelight. It did not rise with energy, but with exhaustion. Each creak of the boards, each sigh of steam from the kettle, each rustle of skirts and shift of shawls was part of the ritual part of the long, invisible exhale that followed the night's invisible labor. By the time the sun had fully risen and painted the walls in gold, the girls had scattered across the upstairs rooms once more. Some were scrubbing linens, some were changing sheets, others were sitting in silence with tea and thread, mending what needed mending, not just fabric, but spirits. Outside, the world resumed. The clatter of wagons, the hiss of the bakery's oven, the bark of a dog that hadn't eaten yet. Life below the brothel carried on with its usual blunt rhythm, while upstairs, the house remained suspended in the in-between, the space where dreams go to rest, and women gather their strength. The guests were gone. The perfume had faded, but in the stillness, a kind of peace returned. Not joy, not ease, but peace. A moment's worth. And sometimes, in a place like this, that was enough. There was a stillness to the brothel on a day off. It wasn't the same hush that followed the final guest's departure or the quiet that settled after a long night. This was a different quiet, lighter somehow, a kind of calm that didn't lean heavy on the bones. It was the silence of choices, of stolen hours, of moments that didn't belong to anyone else but the women who lived within these walls. Not every girl had the same day off. They rotated depending on the schedule, depending on how the evenings had gone. But when a girl had her day, the brothel respected it. No knocks on the door. No calls from the parlor, no makeup, no corsets, no need. Just a day. Ada had hers today. She woke slowly, sun pooling around her ankles through the curtains. The sheets smelled faintly of lilac. She didn't rush to rise. She lay there, counting the rings in the ceiling beam, letting the morning bloom around her without pulling it too close. When at last she sat up, her hair spilled in a long, uncombed curtain down her back. The robe she chose was simple, soft cotton, faded yellow like the rind of a lemon, worn smooth at the sleeves from years of washing. She tied it loosely and padded barefoot down the stairs, ignoring the faint creak of the fourth step, which always threatened to betray the morning's peace. No one stopped her. No one asked anything of her. She moved through the house like a ghost who had nothing left to haunt. Outside, the sky was pale blue and endless. A breeze danced gently through the open front door, curling its fingers through the lace curtains and lifting the hem of the doormat like it was teasing. The porch had already been swept. A pitcher of lemonade sat on the corner table beside a bowl of sugar cubes and a plate of cold biscuits left by Dolly, who had passed through earlier with a knowing smile. Ada poured herself a glass and stepped out into the Sunday. The porch groaned beneath her feet, but it was a familiar sound, like an old friend stretching his arms. The rocking chair welcomed her without question, and she settled into it, tucking one foot beneath the other and letting the day breathe around her. She sipped the lemonade slowly. It was tart, too tart, but it was real, made from actual fruit, not the powdered kind some saloons serve behind their counters. The sugar didn't quite mask the sharpness, but Ada liked it that way. It woke her mouth, reminded her that she was alive, reminded her that the sun was warm, and the sky was wide, and that for a few hours no one would touch her without permission. A few girls joined her, not all at once, not loudly, just one by one, as the day opened like a flower. Genevieve came first, in a loose muslin dress and slippers that didn't quite match. Her hair was braided down her back, and she carried a paperback novel with the corners folded from overuse. She sat on the steps and didn't speak. Then Clara, with her embroidery hoop and a tin of lemon drops. She sat cross-legged near the railing, humming under her breath as she worked a daisy into the corner of a handkerchief she might never finish. June followed soon after, arms full of mending and a jar of pickled eggs from the back pantry. She passed the jar around like communion. They didn't talk about the brothel. Not on days off. They talked about small things. The clouds. The bakery's new boy who had red hair and no front teeth. The price of ribbon at the dry goods store. How long it would take before the rose bush out front gave up its first bloom. Whether or not they'd ever seen the sea. Mostly, though, they just Saturday. The wind tugged at their dresses and braided their words into the branches above. A dog barked in the distance. A child laughed somewhere beyond the fence. The town was awake, but the brothel porch remained on the edge of it, like a little island floating gently in time. Later, a man walked by. Not a customer, just someone from town, a ranch hand, maybe, or a stable boy. His boots were dusty, and his hat was pulled low. He didn't say a word, but he glanced up at the porch, and his eyes met Ada's, only for a moment, long enough for her to notice that he looked away first. She sipped her lemonade. Genevieve lifted an eyebrow. Clara stifled a smile. The breeze shifted. Inside the house, the madam moved quietly through the kitchen, boiling water for tea and humming an old waltz under her breath. She didn't disturb the porch. That space belonged to the girls today. She knew better than to intrude. The sun climbed higher. The lemonade grew warm. The sugar stuck to the rim of the pitcher, and the biscuits crumbled into soft halves. A cat from somewhere, perhaps the neighbors, perhaps a stray, slunk its way onto the porch and curled into a coil beneath Clara's chair, purring without shame. Ada closed her eyes. She could almost forget, just for a moment, almost forget the shape of men's hands, the sound of coins hitting wood, the ache in her back from a mattress too thin and too used. She could almost believe she was somewhere else, someone else, someone who wore yellow robes for pleasure, not practicality, someone whose porch didn't look out over a dusty road leading to a life she hadn't chosen. But even as that thought came, she let it drift away. She didn't need to be someone else. Not today. Today, she was enough. A woman in the sun, with lemonade on her lips, and silence in her hands. And that silence, oh, that silence was a luxury she had earned. Evening would come, eventually. The dresses would return to the hooks. The rouge would be reapplied. The beds would be made and unmade, and the laughter in the parlor would rise once more like smoke. But not yet. Not for a little while. Not until the breeze grew cool and the sun slipped behind the farthest hill, and the rocking chair creaked one final time before surrendering to the night. The town saw its fair share of strangers, drifters with mud on their boots and dust in their pockets. Cowboys between cattle drives, traveling salesmen with more promises than products. Sometimes even a preacher, though they rarely lingered near the brothel. But the man in the blue coat was different. He arrived not on a stagecoach nor on horseback, but walking alone down the main street just after sunrise. The sky behind him was pale and pink, a soft hush draped over the town like a still warm blanket. His coat, a deep navy, stood out against the bleached wood and earth tones of the buildings. It was well cut, too fine for this place. It hung heavy at his sides, weighted by something more than fabric. He carried no luggage, only a leather satchel, worn at the edges and dusted by travel. His hat was tilted just enough to shade his eyes, but those who passed him swore they were green. Not pale green like glass or new grass, but darker, deeper, like pine needles in shadow. He didn't speak to anyone, didn't smile, just walked. Straight down the road, past the saloon, past the post, past the blacksmith's, and right up to the brothel steps. Ada watched him from the parlor window, the lace curtain caught between her fingers. She hadn't dressed yet. Her shift was wrinkled from sleep, and her hair still held the wild shape of her pillow. But something about the man's stride, the slow confidence of it, pulled her gaze like a string. He stopped at the foot of the porch, looked up, then turned away without knocking. No words. No glance back. Just a pause, a presence, and then nothing. By afternoon, the town was talking. The man had taken a room above the tailor's shop. He paid in full, in coins that clinked with a silver ring most hadn't heard in years. He ordered no food, bought no whiskey. He simply walked around the town, quietly, observing. Genevieve said he was a Pinkerton, sent to sniff out secrets. Clara guessed he was a runaway groom hiding from a wedding gone wrong. June swore she'd seen him feed a stray dog behind the livery, crouched low, whispering to it like they shared some language. The madam said nothing. She simply cleaned an extra glass and left it out, just in case. It wasn't until 3 nights later that he returned to the brothel. The girls were lounging in the parlor, music playing softly from the upright piano, the notes trailing like smoke through the thick velvet air. Perfume lingered on the stairs, lamps cast soft shadows. Cards flicked against the table near the hearth where Clara was losing badly to June. Then came the knock. Not rushed, not timid, just 3, even taps against the door. The madam answered. He removed his hat, stepping just far enough into the light for the room to hush. All conversation faded. Even the piano player mid-chord let the notes fall from his fingers. "I'd like to speak with Miss Ada," the man said, his voice smooth as river stones, "if she's available." Ada rose before she even realized she was moving. She hadn't told him her name. No one had. Yet somehow he knew. They sat in the back room. No music there. Just 2 chairs facing each other and a low table set for tea. He didn't touch the cup. "I'm not here for what you think," he said after a long pause. She nodded slowly. "What do you think I think?" He smiled then. A small, tired thing. "That I want what all the others want." Ada didn't answer. She studied him the way his hands rested on his knees, how his coat creased near the collar. He didn't smell of whiskey or smoke. He smelled of dust and sage and something else she couldn't name. "I used to come here," he said, "years ago, before the war." "The war?" she echoed. He nodded. "The one that left me with these hands." He held them up not for pity, but clarity. His knuckles were thick, the skin over them laced with scars, burn marks on his wrist, a faded tattoo on his forearm, a soldier's markings. "I came looking for something," he said quietly. "Not company, not comfort, just something I lost." Ada tilted her head. "What was it?" He didn't speak for a long time. The wind pressed against the window like it was listening. "Peace," he said finally. "The kind that only lives in places like this, between the music and the silence." She understood then. Not fully, but enough. They didn't touch. Not that night, not the next. He came often after that. Saturday in the back room. Sometimes they spoke. Sometimes they didn't. Sometimes they just listened to the sounds of the house around them, the laughter in the hallways, the sighs from upstairs, the clink of ice in a glass left too long on the windowsill. No one asked questions. The madam let it be. One morning, Ada found a book on her nightstand. A book of poetry. No note, no name inside. Just a pressed wildflower on the title page and a ribbon tucked between the lines of a verse that read, "Some strangers pass like storms, and some like seasons, but the rarest come like wind and leave your curtains forever swaying." The blue coat man wasn't seen for a week after that. The town noticed. His room was still paid for, his satchel still there, but no one knew where he'd gone. On the 8th night, Ada opened the book again. The ribbon had moved. Another page marked. Another poem. This one read, "I do not need to be remembered by name, only by the hush I left in the room." She closed the book slowly. and smiled. Outside, the wind caught the curtain just so. The final evening in a place like this rarely announces itself. There is no curtain call, no tolling bell, no final shot of whiskey to mark the closing scene. It comes softly, slipping through the door like a familiar chill, brushing shoulders and loosening ties, setting the heart to listen without knowing exactly why. The brothel had seen countless nights, some vibrant, others dulled by quiet tears and tired laughter, but this one felt different. The oil lamps burned a little lower. The piano was quiet, untouched. Even the scent of lavender in the halls seemed softer, more faded, like a memory. Upstairs, Ada sat at her dresser, brushing her hair slowly. The mirror, aged and mottled with time, offered back a reflection that seemed not just her own, but crowded with ghosts' faces that had leaned in close over the years, eyes that had lingered behind her shoulder, hands that had left behind promises or silence. In the small drawer beneath the mirror, she kept a folded cloth tied with twine. Inside, pressed flat, was the poem, the one with the ribbon, the wildflower. She hadn't moved it since the last time the man in the blue coat had appeared. He never returned. But something told her he had never truly left either. Tonight, though, Ada was not waiting. Tonight she was remembering. She opened the drawer wider. Inside were other things, a button from a Union soldier's coat, a broken locket with no photograph, a tiny vial of perfume no longer scented, a handkerchief embroidered with the letter C, and a cigarette case engraved with initials too worn to decipher. Keepsakes of men long gone, of nights long finished. Each item had a story, and each story lived nowhere but here. Down the hall, Clara sat at the window with a half-smoked cigar between her fingers, her gaze lost in the ink-black sky. She wasn't supposed to smoke indoors, but the madam hadn't scolded her this time. The stars were especially clear tonight. She counted them the way she always did, looking for the same four she called the gambler's hand, because they curved like fingers around the moon. Clara wasn't sentimental, but tonight she thought of her sister back east, of the letter she never sent, of the name she hadn't used in 7 years. She imagined what it might be like to ride away quietly in the morning. No bags, just her boots and her hat and her gambler's hand in the sky to guide her. June, ever the chatterbox, was uncharacteristically still. She was in the kitchen, of all places, kneading bread. The madam had asked her once to learn, and she never really did, but tonight she'd tried. Flour coated her apron and streaked her cheek. The dough stuck to her fingers like memory. She wasn't thinking of customers or outfits or the earrings she'd lost last week. She was thinking of her mother's hands, how they moved over a bowl just like this in a little house near the edge of the prairie. How June used to sit nearby and watch, wondering when she'd be grown enough to be trusted with such things. Now she was grown, and yet tonight, all she wanted was to sit at someone else's table, just once more. The madam stood by the fire in the parlor, swirling a spoon in a cup of tea gone cold. She wasn't tired, not exactly. But a heaviness had settled in her bones, the kind that arrives not from labor, but from the weight of being needed too long. She looked around at the furniture she'd polished so many times she could trace the grain of wood in her sleep. She looked at the chairs where promises had been made, where hearts had broken, where joy had flickered like flame. The brothel wasn't just a place of business, it was a keeper of secrets. And on nights like this, when the wind didn't howl and the windows stayed shut, it held them close like a diary with no lock. Upstairs, Ada lit a candle. She didn't know why. Perhaps it was the stillness, or the feeling that someone should be remembered. She carried the candle to each room, quietly, leaving behind a little flame on each nightstand, each corner. Not for mourning, just to see the shadows soften. Clara joined her, then June, barefoot and flour-dusted. The madam followed, still holding her cold tea. No one spoke. They simply moved from room to room, lighting candles, watching the light dance against wallpaper and mirror, curtain and frame. The house breathed around them. Old floorboards groaned in greeting. The air, warm from the kitchen, drifted up the stairs and curled into the corners like a cat settling for sleep. And when all the candles were lit, they returned to the parlor. Not to drink, not to play, not even to speak. Just to sit. Together. As if waiting for the clock to strike something it never would. Eventually, Ada rose and returned to her room. She opened the drawer again, unfolded the cloth, and laid the poem on her pillow. Then she slipped beneath the quilt and let the darkness close around her, not heavy or cold, but like the inside of a whisper. Downstairs, the madam finally sipped her tea. Still cold, but sweeter somehow. In the months to come, the brothel would change. Girls would come and go. Furniture would be moved. The curtains replaced. A new mirror hung above the parlor mantel. But those who stayed, those who remembered, would always speak of that night. The final evening, not because of who was there, but because of what it felt like the pages of a book had been gently closed. Like the story hadn't ended, just turned quieter. Like the house itself had exhaled. And outside, under a moon just past full, the wind carried no dust that night, only the hush of secret sleeping safe behind closed doors. By morning, the sun slipped shyly over the ridges, casting a pale lemon light that pooled in the narrow alley behind the brothel. The night's silence hadn't yet lifted entirely, only the crows and the low groan of an opening shutter marked the start of another day. Yet even before the girls stirred, even before the kettle whistled or the boots hit the floorboards, one soul was always awake. Her name was Irene. She wasn't one of the working girls, nor was she the madam, though she had been both in another life. Irene was the keeper of numbers, ink, and lace. Keeper of everything that made the brothel something more than just a house with painted walls and whispers in its halls. Her room was small and Spartan, tucked just behind the main staircase on the ground floor. A desk, a lamp, 2 locked cabinets, 1 chair, no mirror. A crucifix hung beside the door, aged and smoky, and beside it, a tiny lace doily the madam had given her on her first morning there 9 years ago. Each morning, without fail, Irene rose before the rest of the house. She lit the lamp even when the sun was already up. It wasn't for the light, it was for the sound. That tiny flick of flint, the soft whoosh of flame, it told her the world had not yet fallen apart. She would sit down, smooth her skirt, and open the ledger. The brothel's finances were a creature of their own, not chaotic, but layered. There were the obvious numbers: what each girl earned, what the house took, what was spent on food, whiskey, coal, laundry, candles, hair oil, linens, boots, thread, paper, ink, and the never-ending stream of small repairs. A hinge here, a cracked mirror there, a busted bedpost that no one admitted to. But behind the numbers, behind the tidy columns of addition and subtraction, Irene tracked something else. Memory. She knew that when Ada's earnings dipped, she was missing someone. She knew that when June spent more than she brought in, she was likely saving someone else, a girl too new or too soft-spoken to say she hadn't made her cut that week. She knew Clara liked to hide her tips in the flower pot in the hallway, and that once every few months, she'd claim she'd been shorted just to feel justified in dipping into her own emergency stash. Irene never confronted them. It wasn't her place. But she wrote it down in tiny notes in the margins, coded in ways only she could read. The madam never asked for that part of the ledger, but she knew it existed, and that was enough. That morning, Irene balanced the books with a slow, patient rhythm. The ink scratched softly. Her posture stayed upright. Her tea went cold beside her elbow, untouched as always. Halfway through a column, she paused. The window at her back was cracked open just enough to let in the scent of fried potatoes from the cookhouse next door. It mingled with the lilac water used in the girls' laundry. For a moment, Irene closed her eyes. The world felt still. Not frozen, not silent, just still, as if the town had paused to breathe in and hadn't yet let go. She opened her eyes again and returned to the ledger. Today, there was something different to add. A loan repaid, a debt forgiven, a girl leaving. June. She was heading west. Further west, she said, to San Francisco, maybe. She'd earned her way, honestly and clean. Irene had watched her save, week by week, squirreling away tips and trimming her own expenses with the precision of someone raised with less than enough. Now, the number beside her name had reached 0. No debts, no balances, no owed favors. Irene reached for the red ink, not often used but reserved for final entries. She drew a careful line across June's name, then beneath it wrote 2 words, paid full. She didn't write left. She never did. It felt too final, too cold. People didn't always leave. Sometimes they just wandered out and wandered back years later, with new names, new shoes, the same eyes. She finished the books, locked them in the cabinet, and rose. The rest of the house had woken. Footsteps creaked overhead. The kettle finally sang. Laughter trailed down the hallway, followed by the soft clink of cups and the gentle knock of the maid collecting linens. In the parlor, June stood by the door with her small satchel and the boots she had polished the night before. They weren't new, but they looked it. Her dress was modest. Her hair braided in a crown around her head, with a yellow ribbon tucked behind one ear. Ada was beside her, a little sad, a little proud. Clara handed her a pair of gloves. No explanation, no fuss. The madam, quiet and composed, said, "You know where we are if you need a place to warm your bones." June nodded, and then Irene stepped forward. She held out a folded slip of paper, June's final ledger note. "Keep it," she said. June unfolded it. Read the 2 words. Smile. "Thank you," she whispered, "for keeping count." Irene only nodded. June stepped outside. The door closed behind her with a soft thud. No fanfare, no parade, just the sound of boots on dry earth, growing softer with every step. Back in her office, Irene reached for the next page in the ledger. There was always another name, another balance, another secret, pressed gently into the margin, because that was what she did. She didn't just count coins, she remembered the parts no one else could. And as long as she did, the brothel would remain more than lace, and laughter it would be a place with a soul, and a story kept safe in ink. In the warm wash of morning light that filtered through gauzy curtains, the brothel stirred with its slow, deliberate rituals. Not hurried, not lazy, just practiced. Clara was the first upstairs to begin the dressing hour, already tugging her corset strings with the kind of deft, one-handed twist that came from years of repetition. Her room smelled faintly of rosewater and something powdered perhaps from a sachet tucked between linens, or from the faint dusting of makeup she always wore, even before breakfast. Outside her door, the hallway filled with footsteps and murmured hellos. A robe rustled, a slipper skidded. Ada passed by humming something from a saloon piano tune, her long chestnut hair still damp from her earlier bath. She always liked to wash before dressing, even if it meant rising before the others. Her routine, she said, made her feel clean in a way that had little to do with soap. The dressing hour in the brothel was a quiet affair, sacred in its own feminine way. No customers allowed, not even the madam intruded unless she needed to. The parlor downstairs could creak and moan with activity, but up here, behind doors slightly ajar and mirrors propped on crates, the women gathered in a small, hushed sisterhood of sorts. It wasn't glamorous, not in the way dime novels described. There was no velvet chaise, no golden light casting soft shadows over marabou and silk. Just chipped vanities, worn hairbrushes, and faded corsetry in various stages of repair. And yet, there was something beautiful in the realism of it all. Each woman had her station. Clara's corner had 3 small jars of powder and rouge she mixed herself with chalk and beat. Ada's area was cluttered with ribbons, pins, and a cracked hand mirror she refused to replace, claimed it held her best angle. Ellie's was almost barren, save for a comb and a square of lace from her sister's wedding dress, pressed into a drawer. Their bodies moved in synchrony, tightening laces, smoothing skirts, pulling stockings up with a practiced snap, not for fashion, not for vanity, but for armor. The corset, though often maligned, was more than restriction. It was structure. It held them together when the world wanted to pull them apart. "Would you lace me?" Clara asked Ada quietly, turning her back and lifting her arms. Ada obliged without a word, threading the ribbons with an ease that suggested deep familiarity. The room filled with the quiet rhythm of breath and pull, as the laces tightened with every inhale. "You're off to the poker house tonight?" Ada asked. Clara nodded. "Sheriff's crowd. No drunks, but they watch every move like you're made of gold dust." "Better than the traveling musicians," Ada said with a small laugh. "Last time one tried to pay me in harmonica lessons." Clara chuckled, her shoulders relaxing just a bit as the final knot was tied. Moments like this wove the women together in ways few men understood. These were not just co-workers. They were confidantes, companions, sometimes even caretakers. There was a tenderness in watching one another transform from early morning softness into evening spectacle, a kind of ceremony, quiet and careful. Down the hall, Ellie sat before her tiny mirror, struggling with a comb caught in a tangle of curls. Clara approached wordlessly, took the comb, and began to work the knots free with gentle fingers and a patience only another woman could afford. "You could leave it loose," Clara offered softly. "That boy from last week liked it wild, didn't he?" Ellie blushed. "He asked if I was a poet." "See?" Clara winked. "That means you're doing something right." They giggled quiet, breathy giggles that never quite filled the room, as if afraid to disturb the balance. The garments themselves were a patchwork of fashion and function. Dresses made new from older fabric, bodices reinforced with spare stitching, petticoats traded and shared like secrets. A pair of earrings might be borrowed, a hairpin passed between rooms, a forgotten perfume bottle resurrected with a few drops of rose oil and grain alcohol. The dressing room, if it could be called, that was not a place of competition. There were no queens and no courtesans vying for favor. Just women making themselves into something men might admire, while holding on tightly to the truth of who they were beneath the ribbons and rouge. It was Ada who finally said what all of them thought from time to time. "Some days I look in the mirror and don't know which face is mine." Clara, still helping Ellie fasten a pearl clasp, responded without looking up. "That's how you know it's working." They paused at that, not because it was cynical, but because it was true. Identity, in the brothel was a river with many names. Sometimes you were June, sometimes you were Miss Rose, sometimes you were nobody, and that was a comfort all its own. As they dressed, they traded more than clothing. They traded quiet affirmations. Compliments not shouted but whispered. That shade suits your eyes. Your lashes look longer today. You should wear that necklace again. No grand declarations, just reminders. You are seen. You are here. You matter. The morning passed in that gentle rhythm, dressing, talking, adjusting. The girls drifted from one room to another, offering hands, opinions, and a little teasing when someone tried a new lipstick or let their hem ride too high. By the time noon came, the transformation was complete. From tired women in robes and knots, they had become walking poems, each line of fabric, each stroke of powder, a stanza written in flesh and silk. But beneath it all, they remained bound to one another not by corsets or cosmetics, but by the invisible thread of shared experience. Outside, the day continued. Patrons arrived. Footsteps echoed down the stairwell. The piano began its soft clinking overture. But inside the dressing rooms, the camaraderie lingered. Not loud, not showy, but present. Corsets cinched, lips stained, glances exchanged. And the unspoken truth hung gently in the air like perfume. They were in this together. The bell downstairs rang once clear and short, followed by two slower chimes. It was the signal the girls had all memorized. A client had arrived. A specific kind, one known to the house, vetted, sober. Likely looking for more than a quick drink and a wink. The kind that came for a conversation, a bath, maybe a slow hour in a quiet room where fantasy didn't have to move too fast. The bell wasn't just a sound, it was a rhythm, a cue, a pulse in the veins of the brothel, and like trained dancers, the women moved in time with it. Clara closed her compact and rose from her vanity, smoothing the hem of her skirt with both palms. Her look tonight was softer than usual, no feathers. Just a simple blue dress with buttons running down the bodice and a thin silver chain resting at her throat. She wasn't aiming for opulence, just familiarity. In the hallway, Ada leaned against the wall, pretending not to listen for the bell, but holding her breath just the same. Her lips were painted crimson, her dress clung in the right places. A lamp nearby flickered as she adjusted the folds at her hip. Ellie appeared next, adjusting her earring with one hand and holding a folded note in the other. A love letter from last week's regular? A grocery list? In this house, it could be both. Madame Josie's voice floated up the stairs, calm, clipped. Ladies, it's Mr. Whitlow. You may remember him. They did. A gentleman farmer turned silver prospector turned something in between. Whitlow was known for his quiet laugh and the way he tipped his hat to each woman, whether she was working or reading or simply passing through with a tray of tea. He was kind, not dull but gentle, a rare thing in a world sharpened by dust and drink. Clara descended first. The others would follow, spaced naturally, giving room for chemistry to do its quiet work. The parlor greeted her with its familiar glow. Oil lamps flickered against wallpaper that had seen better decades. The piano sat silent for now, waiting for its evening revival. Smoke curled from Josie's long cigarette holder, rising like a ribbon toward the ceiling beams. Mr. Whitlow stood by the bar, hat in hand, shoes clean, His jacket hung like it had been brushed 3 times too many. His eyes, kind and tired, scanned the room and settled on Clara. He smiled, small and real. "Clara," he said, voice low and gravel, warmed. "Evenin'." "Evenin', Mr. Whitlow," she replied, tilting her head just slightly. "You look like you've seen the prairie from every side today." He chuckled. "A few hills, a busted wheel, and a coyote who stared at me like he was debating whether I was dinner." Clara laughed softly. "Well, you made it here in one piece. That counts for something." She led him to a quiet table near the window. Not the darkest corner, but far enough from the entrance to make the moment feel theirs. This wasn't about salesmanship, not anymore. With men like Whitlow, it was something slower. A delicate balance of truth and illusion. He didn't want a performance. He wanted presence. As they spoke about cattle prices, rainfall, the stubborn mule who refused to eat apples anymore, Clara slipped into the rhythm she knew so well, listening, nodding, tilting her head at just the right moment. Not as a ruse, but as an offering. Attention was its own kind of currency. Upstairs, the other girls prepared for their evenings. Ada adjusted the lamp in her room just so, wanting the shadows to land gently across her shoulder when she sat by the bed. Ellie cleaned her hands with a lavender cloth, humming quietly to herself as she waited her turn. The business was not about rush, not in this house. Josie had made that clear from the beginning. We don't sell speed here, we sell time. That's what most men really wanted. Time to feel interesting. Time to forget they were lonely. Time to believe, even briefly, that they mattered. Of course, not every client was a Whitlow. Some came drunk, their words slurred and expectations sharpened. Some bargained, some complained, but those were managed. Boundaries were drawn like invisible fences, and each woman knew how to reinforce them, sometimes with laughter, sometimes with silence. And always, Josie was there. The madam, though often downstairs with a ledger or pipe, was never out of reach. If a door closed too hard, if a voice rose unexpectedly, if a girl's expression changed in a way she didn't recognize, Josie noticed. She might appear in the doorway with a tray of drinks or a light knock on the panel. Never invasive, always aware. Back at the table, Whitlow was now talking about stars, how on clear nights the sky looked like a spilled jar of sugar across black velvet. Clara smiled. "That's beautiful," she said, and meant it. He looked down at his hands. "I always think it's funny," he murmured, "how we can sit under all that and still feel like we're indoors." Clara tilted her head. "Maybe because home ain't always walls. Maybe it's just who you're with." He didn't reply, but his smile deepened in the way that said, "Thank you for understanding what I couldn't quite say." An hour passed like a warm breeze. Clara stood with him when he rose, walked him to the door, and accepted his quiet goodbye without needing to add anything more. The bell rang again shortly after. A new signal, a different rhythm. This time it was for Ada. And so the dance continued. Downstairs and upstairs, in laced boots and whispered jokes, in corset hooks and careful refusals, in powder and promise and protection. The brothel wasn't just a place of work. It was a stage where the act was never just performance, but a choreography of boundaries and trust, of listening and letting go. And when the bell rang, they answered not because they had to, but because they'd learned the music by heart. The evening sun dipped low, staining the windows with rust-colored streaks as it filtered through the fine red lace curtains. Outside, the dust settled into long golden shadows that stretched like reaching fingers across the quiet street. The brothel was preparing for the hush that often came before the true night began, the lull between the first visitors and the last calls, where stories were whispered more often than shouted, and secrets breathed against wallpaper worn smooth by time. Inside, lanterns were being trimmed, and the piano was given its final touch-up by old Clyde, who, though mostly deaf, still insisted on tuning it by hand. He hummed as he worked, a strange melodic thrum with no discernible rhythm, but it comforted the girls, a strange metronome marking the transition between late dusk and early mischief. Clara sat upstairs by the window in the reading room, a quiet space Josie had carved out from one of the old storage lofts. It had a small bookshelf, 2 armchairs that sagged from years of listening, and a half-broken clock that still kept excellent time if you hit it just once at the top of each hour. She wasn't reading tonight. Instead, she watched the town below. A boy was chasing a paper hat down the road. A mule stood motionless beside a broken wagon wheel. A woman with a thick shawl and a deeper scowl shuffled past, pretending not to glance at the lit windows of the brothel. Pretending curiosity wasn't the heaviest thing in her basket. Clara knew this time of night well. It was the moment the mask slipped. When the men came not because they were drunk, but because they weren't. When they needed something softer than whiskey, something that couldn't be poured. Tonight, the saloon next door had closed early due to a broken keg line. The brothel would be busier, not with partygoers, but with the quieter ones, the ones who usually stopped themselves at the swing door, unsure. The ones who looked both ways before knocking. Josie stood in the parlor, adjusting the floral arrangement by the piano. She always said flowers helped men feel like they were entering a home instead of a transaction. Not that she believed all the men deserved that softness, but the women did. And if creating an illusion of home made the work easier, safer, more manageable, then she'd line every stair with roses if she had to. In one of the upstairs rooms, Ellie practiced the violin, just the low strings tonight. She said it helped her heart beat slower when the nerves came on. She wasn't playing for anyone, not yet. Maybe later, when the parlor was full, she might bring the notes down to the landing and let the sound drift like smoke. Below, in the farthest corner of the hallway, Ada stood in front of the mirror, holding a folded letter to her chest. No one knew who wrote to her. She never said. But every Thursday for the last 3 months, she received a note at the back door. Always the same. Folded once, no return name, just the initials, WG, and a sentence that read like poetry and prayer. She never replied, but she always smiled after reading it. The girls had their secrets. Some were small, a stash of sweets behind the dresser, a child's drawing pinned beneath a loose floorboard, an old ribbon saved from a younger year. Others were heavier, buried in letters never mailed, or names never spoken after lights went out. And the house itself, it kept its own. Behind the saloon curtains, past the parlor and the laughter, was a locked room. It had no bed, No perfume bottles or lace curtains. Just a desk, a safe, and a trunk filled with records that Josie alone read. The trunk contained stories, histories, birth names, family addresses, medical notes, warnings, wishes. Every girl had a page, handwritten in Josie's looping script, not for control, but for care. If something happened, if a girl left suddenly or didn't return, Josie wanted to make sure someone knew who they had been. Clara's page included the word teacher. Ellie's had musician. Ada's was marked with runaway but brave. Those pages lived like soft ghosts beneath the floor, whispering only to the one woman who protected them. Outside, the wind changed. Night air began to push through the town, carrying the scent of dry grass and smoke from distant campfires. A dog barked. A harmonica played off-key somewhere near the freight depot, and across the street, a man lit a cigarette with shaking hands, staring up at the second-story windows of the brothel. He didn't come in. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But that didn't matter. The brothel saw them, all, the ones who entered and the ones who almost did, the hopefuls and the haunted, the curious, the cruel, and the kind. As the first client of the night crossed the threshold, Josie greeted him with a smile that could melt glass. And the piano began to play softly. Clyde had finished his tuning, and now he offered the girls a gentle waltz to begin their evening shift. Clara came down the stairs slowly, smoothing the soft folds of her shawl. She wasn't needed yet, but she liked to sit near the lamp and listen. Sometimes, that's all anyone really wanted. A chair, a voice, a lamp turned low. A room where you could pretend, just for a while, that the world outside didn't ache quite so much. And so the night began again, red light flickering behind velvet curtains, secrets resting quietly in drawers and hearts, and the soft music of lives lived gently, if only between the hours of sunset and sleep. The morning had long passed, the afternoon had waned, and now the late evening hung like a velvet curtain over the brothel, thick and deep and quiet. Lamps glowed low, not yet dim enough to be called night, but low enough to tell the truth. The bustle of earlier hours was finished, and what came next was not business, but the slow unwinding of hearts too tired to keep up pretenses. The parlor had emptied somewhat, the piano resting with a blanket thrown over its keys like a tired animal asleep in the corner. Clyde had long since gone home. His wife insisted he return before midnight, and Josie, despite her teasing, never kept him longer than she needed to. His old bones were better served in bed than on a bench. Tonight, the mood was quieter than usual. Even the laughter, where it came, sounded hushed, almost reverent. Not because anything tragic had happened, but because some days simply asked for stillness, and the house knew how to listen. Clara stood at the end of the hallway with a kettle in hand, pouring hot water into mismatched porcelain cups. She did this every night around this time, whether anyone asked for it or not. Some girls drank it black, bitter and sharp. Others added sugar cubes, stirring them until they disappeared like secrets in the dark. Josie had a fondness for chamomile with a twist of lemon peel. She claimed it kept the nerves at bay. Whether it did or not was beside the point. The ritual helped. And so she sipped, slowly, from the chipped blue cup with the painted dandelion that nobody else dared use. In one of the small reading rooms just off the parlor, tucked behind a curtain of beaded thread, Ada and Ellie sat cross-legged on a thick rug that used to belong to a stagecoach lobby. Between them, a low table had been cleared, save for a tiny bowl of old tea leaves, now splayed out like bird bones drying in the Sunday's. "I see a horse," Ellie said, squinting into the soggy mess. Ada raised a brow. "You always see a horse." "It's a sign," Ellie insisted, smiling into her mug. "Of what? That you want to run? Or maybe that I already did." They both laughed, but quietly. These were the kinds of conversations that filled the space between customers, between chores and memories. They weren't always profound, but they meant something. In the brothel, time wasn't just marked in coin or kisses. It was measured in the comfort of familiar voices, in shared glances, in knowing someone would refill your cup before you asked. Outside, tobacco smoke curled in slow spirals from the porch railing where Dottie sat with her legs tucked under her, wrapped in an old shawl. She didn't speak much, not when she was in this mood. But she didn't need to. Josie had placed a second chair beside her anyway, and Clara had left her a cup of tea strong, the way she liked it. A stranger might pass and think Dottie was waiting for someone, but those in the house knew she was remembering. Inside the walls of the brothel lived dozens of memories. Some spoke loudly, and others whispered only when the lights were low. On nights like these, the whole building seemed to breathe with them, like lungs filled with the soft exhale of stories too long held in. Clara sat with Josie at the round table beneath the window, the one with lace trim and burn marks from when someone long ago tried to warm a brandy snifter over a candle. "Funny how the quiet stretches," Clara said. Josie nodded, folding her hands around her cup. "Not funny, really, just honest." There was a difference between silence and quiet. Silence was the absence of sound. Quiet was the presence of peace. And the brothel, for all its reputation, knew peace in its own strange way. Sometimes, after the noise, after the knocking, after the footsteps and laughter and weeping and business had come and gone, what was left behind was a kind of stillness too soft to measure. The kind you didn't find in churches or courthouses, but maybe in kitchens after a long meal, or barns after the cows had been fed. It was an honest stillness, earned through the motion that came before. Josie looked toward the window and took another sip. "They'll say what they want about us. They always do." Clara didn't argue. She didn't have to. "They'll say we're sinners, that we trade in shame," Josie continued. "But I look around here, and I don't see shame. I see women making something out of the scraps they were given. I see kindness. I see strength." Clara raised her cup slightly. And good tea, Josie chuckled, raising her own in return. Don't forget the tea. In the far hallway, someone played a few slow notes on a harmonica, just a few. Not a song, exactly. More like the start of one. It lingered in the air like perfume, then vanished. The house creaked gently as it settled into its bones for the night. A loose shutter tapped against the upstairs window. Someone turned over in their bed. A sigh drifted down the staircase like a ribbon. And the girls, wherever they were in the parlor, the reading room, out back with the chickens, or curled up under quilts patched with fabric from 5 different counties, closed their eyes. The night didn't always need words. Sometimes it just needed tea leaves and tobacco smoke. Quiet chairs left empty for company that may or may not arrive. And the knowledge that in this place, in this strange red-lit home of worn wallpaper and softer music, no one sat alone unless they wished to. And even then, not for long. As the first pale hints of dawn began stretching thin fingers across the sky, the town of Dustmere still slept. But inside the brothel, a different kind of waking stirred, not urgent, not noisy, but the slow, comforting kind that began with the clink of teacups and the low hum of thread pulling through fabric. The sewing room wasn't on the map of the house, not really. It had once been a supply closet, then a utility room, then simply that room with a good light. The girls had claimed it slowly, one forgotten afternoon at a time, until it turned into something of a ritual. Here, the sun found its way easiest through a long sash window with a cracked pane in the bottom corner, and even in winter, a sliver of gold would rest on the worn floorboards like a lazy cat by morning. There was no formal invitation to the sewing circle. You just showed up. A torn hem, a frayed sleeve, a ripped petticoat, it didn't matter. Someone always had extra thread. Someone always had pins in her mouth. And someone always had gossip too tired to be juicy. Josie never announced it. She'd just appear with a half-mended corset or a pile of linens needing patchwork. Clara often came with tea, and Dottie, though she rarely spoke much, stitched with the kind of precision that made even the stubbornest seams lie flat. Ada stitched buttons that had long since rolled under furniture. Ellie embroidered flowers on handkerchiefs she never used. Mabel repaired gloves, even though no one wore them much anymore. It didn't matter what you mended, only that you sat in the room, listening to the quiet harmony of female hands doing what women had done for centuries, fixing what had been worn by life. The room smelled like lavender sachets and soap, but also of old wood, tea steam, and candle wax. A little box of buttons sat in the middle of the table. Some were glass, some wood, others made of bone or brass. None of them matched. Just like the women who sat around them, the talk was never loud. It didn't need to be. Whispers were easier when your fingers were busy. Stories floated between needle strokes. "I saw the sheriff's wife in town yesterday," said Clara, threading a needle. "Oh?" said Ada, not looking up. "Was she buying silk again?" "Number bread. Real bread. From the bakery." There was a pause. Everyone understood. Buying bread meant things were going well. Silk meant she was trying to convince the world they were. Must be a good week for her, Ellie muttered, adjusting the trim on a sleeve. Let's hope it lasts, said Mabel, reaching for the scissors. It wasn't gossip, not really. It was observation, gentle, knowing, and without cruelty. The girls in the brothel knew the power of watching. They saw things others didn't. And in the sewing room, they let those things settle into the soft hum of thread and cloth. Sometimes they talked about old lives, names they hadn't used in years, towns that were only remembered through the way someone said train station or river walk. Every woman here had come from somewhere else, carrying stories in her hemline. Josie once said the sewing room was the closest thing they had to a church, not because it was holy, but because it was honest. Here, nobody lied. You didn't need to. In this room, there were no corsets to tighten, no powder to apply, no petticoats to fluff. There was no performance, only process. Here, you didn't have to seduce anyone or pretend to be untouchable. You just sat, side by side, each woman pulling her own thread through her own pain. And every now and then, someone would reach over and tie off a knot for you when your hands got too tired. There was power in that. Dottie's hands were calloused, but her stitches were always neat. She worked in silence, mending a coat pocket. It had belonged to a man who no longer came around, but Josie kept it on a hook near the door. Are you going to keep fixing that thing forever? Ellie asked gently. Dottie didn't look up. Probably. And that was the end of that conversation. The sun had crept further in now, spilling across the table like honey. It turned the room gold, made the tea look brighter, and the dust more forgiving. The light touched everyone's face, made the lines in their cheeks softer, the freckles more honest. Josie leaned back in her chair and watched the room. I hope, she said almost too quietly, that if I die in this place, someone keeps sewing. It wasn't a dramatic statement. It wasn't morbid. It was just a wish. Because the brothel had plenty of noise and business and velvet and brandy and perfume, but it was the sewing room that made it a home. It was the quiet rhythm of needles, the unspoken offers of help, the stories stitched into sleeves and cuffs, the way someone always brought sugar for the tea, even when they swore they were cutting back. When a dress was mended here, it didn't just go back on the rack. It went out into the parlor with a little more dignity, a little more grace. When a girl left the room with fresh thread in her skirt, she walked straighter not because the world had changed, but because she had. In time, the light faded. The needles were capped. The chairs were pushed back. But the warmth stayed. Long after the sewing stopped,